One of Edelman's contexts in Tea Rooms and Sympathy is the public restroom, the threat to stability, that is, to the fixity of heterosexual identity and to heterosexual mastery of the signifiers of difference portended by the men's room itself. Edelman writes that this threat can be intuited more readily when the restroom is considered, not as by Lacan in terms of urinary segregation, a context that establishes the phallus from the outset as the token of anatomical difference, but instead as the site of a loosening or relaxation of sphincter control, with the subsequent evocation of an eroticism undifferentiated by gender in Freudian etiology, because anterior to the genital tyranny that raises the phallus to its privileged position. Precisely because the phallus marks the putative stability of the divide between ladies and gentlemen, because it articulates the concept of sexual difference in terms of visible perception, the urinary function in the institutional men's room customarily takes place within view of others, as if to indicate its status as an act of definitional display, but the private enclosure of the toilet stall signals the potential anxiety at issue in the West when the men's room becomes the locus not of urinary but intestinal relief. For the satisfaction that such relief affords abuts dangerously onto homophobically objectified desires. Citing several instances in 1960s journalistic and literary discourse of an anxious troping of the men's room as a stinking cloacal cavern, Edelman writes that these displaced but insistent spatial tropes suggest the anxiety of an internal space of difference, an overdetermined opening or invagination within the male, of which the activity of defecation may constitute an unnerving reminder. Following Edelman, I would reiterate that it is not only these particular spatial tropes, but writing itself, which is always insistently, tropaically spatial and displaced, that suggests or provokes anxiety, that serves as the unnerving reminder not only of defecation but, by nervous extension, of that overdetermined opening or invagination within the male. Thus, to the extent that writing is an inevitable condition of identity formation, within a dynamic symbolic order, writing always potentially undoes any identity that sequesters or stalls itself in terms of its very resistance to being done, to being fucked, to homophobically abjected feminine desires that are both sexually specific and metaphorically general. Edelman's writing on the stalling and destalling of masculine subjectivity in terms of homeographesis allows an interesting point of entry into the third thing I wish I had known while writing Male Matters, Galway Kinnell's poem Holy Shit. Opening with a set of epigraphs spanning the history of idealism from Plato to Jung, all concerning the turd and its abject confederates, my favorite among the epigraphs being Valentinus's Jesus ate and drank but did not defecate. Kinnell's poem laments the human hostility to shit and shitting, argues against the idealistic desire to sever the chain of linked turds tying us to some hole in the ground. Most valuable, from my perspective, the poem concerns the political consequences of this hostile desire. In a sort of etymological editorial aside, Kinnell blasts the absurdity of the fact that the American newspapers that were so enamored of the smart weapons of the Gulf War would never print that indecent word shit, despite a lineage going back to the Indo-European, from skeed to shed to drop. Kinnell also brilliantly depicts the violently imperialist projection of abject vulnerability onto the other, what Edelman calls a cultural imperative to anal sadistic behavior, when he writes of Americans imagining we are a people who don't die, who come out of the sky like gods and drop not shit but bombs on people who shit. Kinnell, however, drops a little bomb of his own here. In the section of the poem that I have included as an epigraph to this essay, we find the child Jeanette stalled in the silken peace of the outhouse, feeding his imagination on the odor and darkness. Kinnell then writes, "For myself, it was many years before I could get near the poetry section in a bookstore, or PS 3521 in library stacks, without a sudden urge to shit. I don't know why, unless envy or emulation, a need, like a coyote's or hyena's, to set down my identity in scat." Now, what interests me about this passage is the way Kinnell brings his most intimately confessional conflation of writing with defecation. None of the rest of the poem so explicitly concerns the act of writing or Kinnell's own urge into such close proximity with the homosexual writer Genet. None of the rest of the writers mentioned, Dante, Swift, etc., are queer. One is tempted to call this proximity homographic in that it seems to signify a recognition of the way Kinnell's mixed urge to write shit abuts with the adult Genet's objectified homosexual desire. But one might also discern here Kinnell's own sense of the danger of that abutment, so that the line beginning "for myself" may signal not an identification with, but rather a nervous distanciation from the roosting Genet. Indeed, Kinnell's bearing of his urges leads him, mysteriously, I don't know why, not back into Genet's outhouse, but rather to the land of coyotes and hyenas, to the white-tailed deer and the canary, to the wilder but perhaps less dangerous realm of the animal kingdom, in which there is plenty of scat, but conspicuously, neither identity nor writing. This totemized animalization, this positively naturalized unhumanization of Kinnell's desire, can be read as an objectifying and dehumanizing flight from Genet's. In Bodies That Matter, Butler writes that the notion of abjection designates a degraded or cast-out status within the terms of sociality. Indeed, what is foreclosed or repudiated is precisely what may not re-enter the field of the social without threatening the dissolution of the subject itself. I want to propose that certain abject zones within sociality also deliver this threat, constituting zones of uninhabitability, which a subject fantasizes as threatening its own integrity with the prospect of a psychotic dissolution. I would rather die than do or be that. On the one hand, I do not see enough evidence in Kinnell's poem to justify the claim that he finds Genet's outhouse a zone of uninhabitability, the entry to which would threaten him with psychotic dissolution. On the other, I do see unfortunate evidence, in a poem I otherwise admire, that, when it comes to facing up to what writing sets down, Kinnell would rather emulate a coyote or a canary than a queer, would rather be a hyena than a homo. Granted, this preference is not as extreme as Butler's, I would rather die than do or be that, since the animals in question are supposedly alive, but it still seems an objectifying move that has the effect of consecrating holy shit by separating it from the holy shit. This subtle but urgent move on Kinnell's part leads me to be somewhat suspicious of the sanctimoniousness of the poem's closing lines. Let us sit, bend forward slightly, and be opened a moment, as earth's holy matter passes through us. Lines that urge me to hope, but not pray, for openings of a slightly less referential bent. In this essay, I have moved from a consideration of discussions between feminist women, Butler, Braidotti, Rubin, to an examination of matters that might seem strictly between men, Edelman, Genet, Kinnell. If the essay's movement thus seems to be away from feminism and toward queer theory, its primary urge, on the contrary, has been in solidarity with Butler's desire not only to link feminism and queer theory, but to establish their constitutive relationship. Now, if that relationship were obviously established, there would perhaps be no such thing as misogyny among gay men or homophobia among feminist women, which of course there continues to be. But my concern here has not been with these aspects of gay male or feminist female subjectivities, for which, respectively, misogyny and homophobia have complex valences and which, in any case, are not exactly identical with the reproduction of straight male hegemony, though they're not exactly removed from such reproduction either. My concern has been with straight male subjectivity and with the possibility of its productive dissolution, its dirty-minded, corporeo-discursive failure to uphold the phallus. It is the constitutive relationship between misogyny and homophobia in the formation of properly phallic, straight male subjects that makes the link between feminism and queer theory crucial for those interested in deforming and transforming masculinity. My particular take involves the ways misogyny and homophobia are inscribed in writing as well as the possibilities of deformation and transformation that a radically reenfleshed writing might open up. There are, of course, many ways of opening masculinity to change, but by recognizing what is actually on the line when straight male identity is put down in writing, is set down in script, if not in scat, we may also see new ways, metaphorical and specific, of beginning to bring down, or at least fundamentally disturb, that identity's disembodied kingdom.